This video is a tribute to one of the finest Dutch intellectuals of this moment, the philosopher Rob Riemen, for whom it took 8 years to graduate from high school, while other simple souls managed to do so in 6 years, and who studied 10 years at a Dutch university although following a curriculum mastered by all other students in, again, just 6 years. Rob Riemen is nevertheless a highly intelligent person. That he exceeded the total 12 years term for high school and university with an additional 6 years, has nothing to do with the brilliance of his mind. He lost track of time during his college days because he read so many books of great philosophers, historians, and writers, whose ideas he adopted and learned by heart, due to which he is able today to recite their work off the cuff, showing his excellence. It's therefore understandable that he mentions the names of the great European thinkers in every message he broadcasts, making sure that the public starts to appreciate him as one of them, one of the highly gifted few.
So I started to read everything of Thomas Mann, and through Thomas Mann it was channeled to Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Goethe, trying to become familiar with this whole world and this whole mindset.
Rob Riemen is blessed with the exceptional intellectual gift to apply philosophical theories of 50, 100, or even 2,000 years ago entirely unaltered to current circumstances, because these concepts, according to him, represent an evidenced universal truth that goes beyond a description of subjective moral viewpoints embedded in the time period in which they were created. One of Riemann's best-known philosophical elaborations is the existence of the mass man, a certain type of human being that forms the majority in any population, and that Riemann derived from the Spanish cultural philosopher José Ortega y Gasset in his book The Revolt of the Masses, written in 1930. So let us first hear what Riemann has to say about this mass man and the dangers attached to his existence.
Hello dear audience. In this lecture I want to explain my ideas about modern society and the role of modern man in it. Building on the thoughts of Thomas Mann, who after World War II claimed that the military victory over fascism was anything but a defeat of fascism as such, I will show that fascism is still present in our society, as a bacillus. The characteristics of a bacillus are that they can hide for a long time so as to suddenly reappear, possibly causing a lethal epidemic. Great thinkers such as Goethe, de Tocqueville, Nietzsche, Ortega y Gasset and many others are with me. They foresaw what we actually have become today, nihilists, a so-called mass man. But what is a mass man? How is he put together? Who is he, and most importantly, what does he do and what makes him so dangerous? Fascism, which has been present silently among us always, returns today in full force. We see it all around us in the rise of right-wing populism. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders. Donald Trump in the USA. In France, Marine Le Pen, the AFD in Germany. Who would prefer Donald Trump over Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh? No, no. The other's Vincent van Gogh. Then you are aware of the difference between the mass man on the one side, and the intellectual elite on the other. The rise of right-wing populism is carried by the contemptible mass man. This will ultimately lead to fascism. Of course, the right-wing populist leaders of today are not so stupid to disclose themselves as neo-Nazis or fascists. They all reject such policies and ideologies. That is, officially. But what they officially say and do, cannot be believed, cannot be trusted. That their party program does not correspond to a fascist ideology, that they speak in favor of more democracy, and respect individual freedom, is a false representation to the outside world. They all have a hidden agenda built on fascist principles. Of course these principles are not exactly the same as that of Hitler and Mussolini. Of course they have somewhat adjusted their views to contemporary ideas. No, you will not see them in uniforms marching through the streets. No, they do not beat up other citizens in an alley. But that's just cosmetic hypocrisy. In essence, when you look at their core belief, they are truly fascist, as I have shown in respect of Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom in the Netherlands in my book The Eternal Return of Fascism. On the basis of objective scientific criteria, I have conclusively proven that the Party for Freedom carries all the elements of a fascist party. Let's just look at reality. A charismatic leader who turns against the ruling elite on behalf of the common people. Where did we hear that before? An elite that has no ear for the wishes, complaints, and problems of the public, but is only interested in more power and personal gain. Again, do you recognize it? An elite that lies to the population and deliberately suppresses the common folks by spreading misinformation. Only Geert Wilders is honest, and only he knows what the common people want, only he defends the interests of the ordinary men and women. Only he says it like it is, and opposes heroically against the intellectual elite. Isn't that exactly the same as German fascism? No one with a sound mind can deny this. Surely, they present themselves differently. But that is how current fascism acts today. Yet it's the same as German and Italian fascism if you look beyond first appearances and get rid of the aspects not in line with fascism, that are merely concealed by them to hide their real intentions. But they have no solutions for the problems we face at this moment. Just as Hitler and Mussolini, they are liars and frauds. The current populist movements and their leaders are no different than the fascist movements prior to World War II, and are a danger for European humanism and honest moral values, for human advancement. I cannot repeat it enough. People wrongly relate fascism to uniforms, banners, marches, public meetings, a dictatorship imposed by force. Contemporary fascism doesn't look like that. But these visible formal features are not the essence of fascism. That is the politicization of the vindictive masses that have no spiritual values. This type of fascism can be expressed in any form. Therefore, look beyond that first appearance. Look at what is really happening. Geert Wilders exploits the resentment among the population, indicates foreigners as scapegoats, and opposes the elite and all intellectual, cosmopolitan, or other humans deviating from the common people. For this purpose he misuses nationalist feelings. I use the aforementioned term fascism to be able to understand populism much better. You just have to find out what cultural history lays behind the movement of Wilders. And then I see many parallels with fascism. You must not look at how fascism ended with Auschwitz, but at the way how it started, as a populist movement that seized power. Even the glorification of violence is reflected in contemporary populism. People no longer molest others physically. They choose contemporary forms to attack scapegoats or political opponents standing in their way. Sitting behind their computer, they send evil messages to the world and threaten the civilized people of the elites they hate so much. Don't be fooled by appearances or by what they say or do. In truth, that man behind his computer is the same as a Nazi walking in 1933 in uniform beating up Jews. The core essence is exactly the same. That's because the mass man feels and acts like that. That mass man hasn't changed. He is still with us today, as Thomas Mann, Goethe, Paul Valéry, Menno ter Braak and Max Scheler have proven. And on this mass man, fascism, like current populism, thrives. A germ that has to be exterminated for the sake of humanity, for the sake of the good, and of the beauty that life has to offer too. The arts, novels, books, paintings, operas, cultural excellence, humanity, morality, love for your fellow man, everything the mass man despises. So who is that mass man? Yes, Donald Trump is one of them. But what are his characteristics in general? The mass man despises culture. Culture in its original meaning is a moral concept, it is a critical notion. As my friend Georges Tenable said, culture is about coming to our better selves. Culture, in this meaning, is indeed indispensable for any form of civilization. But culture is much more. But the mass man cannot understand it. He therefore is not interested in it. He sees no beauty, no sacred moral values. He feels no love for his fellow men. The mass man is only interested in himself, and is triggered solely by his lusts and desires, his hunger for material wealth and sexual satisfaction. Because he lacks any spiritual guidance and is unable to understand the higher culture, he rejects it. For him, only what the masses still may grasp, is the highest and only existing truth. The mass man is greedy, xenophobic, racist, selfish, dumb, only interested in himself and the petty mass culture he can comprehend. The mass man feels no love for his fellow man, for another human being. He only wants to satisfy his desires and needs, if need be at the cost of others. He only reads gossip magazines, only watches reality soaps, sport programs or popular shows, because these are the only things he can understand. The mass man doesn't read novels of great writers or philosophical works. He doesn't go to Rome or the National Museum in London. He cannot understand it. Therefore cannot appreciate it, since it doesn't contribute to his inner needs. Thus he discards the political, intellectual, and cultural elites that have created that strange spiritual work and values and that do understand their beauty and importance. Instead, the mass man goes to the Costa Brava or a bungalow park, where only similar mass men are surrounding him. We, that is to say the elites, do have an awareness of ideas about failures, we know about truth, beauty, justice, and freedom, but the mass man does not want to be confronted, let alone be burdened with intellectual or spiritual failures, because he believes the truth will restrict him. Life for mass man must be easy and abundant, everything must be permitted, for there are no constraints. The mass man does not think, and without any spiritual guidance, he clings to the weight of the masses, which will lead him through life. In this nihilistic society, spiritual failures are replaced by greed and fear, and spiritual life is replaced by kitsch. The need for kitsch is there because they need a cover for their spiritual emptiness and the pointlessness of their life. Spiritual life is not wasted on the mass man. Fun is the ultimate measure for all things he invests in. His friends must be nice, his school, his studies, his work, and in his free time he wants amusement. Mass media, sports, games, everything has to be nice, the mindset must be nice, and you also have to be nice to him. If not, the mass man will become aggressive and violent. He is driven by jealousy, fear, by envy against others who seem to have more, which he can't accept because everyone is supposed to be equal, having the same material rights. Why isn't that the case? Why do the elites control society and have much more wealth and freedom, much more life opportunities? The mass man cannot see that this is the result of his own failure, his own lack of spiritual and moral values, his own greed and smallness, his own fear for true freedom, which he cannot apply as a consequence of his limited rational capacities and the absence of everything that is good in human life. So he starts to hate the ones who represent that. He starts to feel resentment. This envy, combined with the incapacity to understand higher culture and spiritual life, makes him angry and violent. Someone has to be blamed for his misfortune, for his worse position, for everything that is not immediately perfect in his life. A scapegoat, like Jews, Muslims, immigrants. And the elites who seem to look so good after themselves, those are the ones depriving the mass man from happiness and his fair share of wealth and possibilities. Fascism exploits these crises, these fears, and these instincts of the mass man. Fascist politics is based on crude materialism, it's a politics of resentment and hatred and based on permanent lies. Fascists are the best liars ever, they always have to have scapegoats, the Jews, the Americans, the Muslims, the poor, whoever abuses the fear of freedom, it's an anti-democratic strategy, that's why they will never engage in a serious discussion. It's nationalistic, and it's built on tribalism. So now we know what the great danger for the future of mankind is, for the higher culture and spiritual life, for our democratic and free society. Yes, my dear people, that's fascism, and this in the sense of a political movement of the vindictive masses against the political, intellectual and cultural elites. The next question is, how to stop this threat, this disaster for human society, for morality, for mankind as a whole. What can we do to suppress these vindictive hurdles of mass men trying to gain power, or at least, how can we control the masses so as to ensure that the bacillus in them cannot destroy everything that is beautiful, good, just and fair? If we want to prevent such a catastrophe, we first have to know who the mass man is. Not just what he is, or how he acts. I have clarified that already before. But now the question is, how can we actually recognize him in real life, which is necessary to address and control him? Fortunately, it is not so hard to identify the mass man, because he shows himself in the prototypical elements of the mass culture in which he dwells. Although not aware of it himself, he displays his smallness and petty ideas in the clothes he wears, in the car he drives, in the house he lives in the furniture he has chosen, in the TV shows he watches, in the music to which he listens on the radio, in the gossip magazines and newspapers he reads, in his children, how they look and what they do, in tattoos and jewelry, in the bars and public places the mass man visits, in the work he performs, the level of the job he ultimately is able to reach, in the schools and subjects he is learning, in his holiday destinations, in his hobbies and interactions with other mass men in his spare time. Again, don't be fooled by their friendly appearance, their nice words or their so-called empathy. They cannot think, they cannot feel love, do not understand anything that goes beyond mass culture, they do not appreciate arts or spiritual life, of which they have no clue. Driven by envy and hate against the political, intellectual, and cultural elites, they will start to unite in large crowds, and then under the leadership of a charismatic fascist leader, they will mechanically start their march of demolition, destroying everything on their way, everything the elites have created and, with that, everything that's worthwhile and good in humanity, only so as to replace it by the simple mass culture they can comprehend. Now we must turn our normal views around. Be open for a mind-blowing mind change. How do I know that the mass man is dominating populism, and therefore always will lead to fascism, in fact is already fascism today, meaning the end of Western civilization and human advancement? Why am I so sure that this will happen, and very soon indeed? I tell you, read the great philosophers. Hear what they had to say and what they predicted. Then you know it is true. You are not convinced yet? Then let me make it clear. Wasn't it Thomas Mann who said, the combined luster of sense happiness and soul's peace, the artist's notion that beauty relieves us of the frightening choices between them, that it gives rise to a human unity between sensuality and virtue, that it reconciles our earthly and our higher nature, building a bridge between ideal and life, that the varying idea of the good belongs in praise to both worlds, the aesthetic and the moral, and the beauty and truth fuse in art, that tutor of human race? Wasn't it Thomas Mann who taught us the following, passionate, that means to live for the sake of living. But one knows that you all live for the sake of experience. Passion, that is self-forgetfulness. But what you all want is self-enrichment. The first step to evil, to the fall of humanity, was the primeval stage of matter, the transition from the insubstantial to the substance. That is what we can, and must learn from Thomas Mann. Wasn't it Friedrich Nietzsche who stated, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Didn't he make it clear when he said, not necessity, not desire, no, the love of power is the demon of man. Let them have everything, health, food, a place to live, entertainment, they will nevertheless be and remain unhappy and low-spirited, for the demon waits and waits and will be satisfied. Man is a rope, tied between beast and Übermensch. I say, following Nietzsche's ideas, through our spiritual life we can overcome that man, we can become the Übermensch, the overman. Not all will be able to follow us. The mass man is predestined to stay behind, for he lacks the required capacities to make it to the other side, to the end phase of humanity. Compassion is the basis of morality, as Schopenhauer made clear. The mass man doesn't feel any compassion. He is self-centered, only looking for maximum self-satisfaction of his material wants and sexual yearnings. He is racist and xenophobic, a tribal man, who cannot understand anything outside his small crowd and simple views. Remember, that is why José Ortega y Gasset noticed that there is a distinction between the noble life and the common life, between the intellectual and cultural elites and the barbarism and primitivism of the mass man. And this has yet again gone too far, reaching yet again a dangerous level. Ortega y Gasset mentioned the reason, a type of man who did not care to give reasons or even to be right, but who was simply resolved to impose his opinions. That was the novelty, the right not to be right, not to be reasonable, the reason of unreason. That is what our current mass culture implies, where everyone is supposed to be equal and demands for himself that equal place. Menno ter Braak saw the same development prior to the rise of German and Italian fascism, when he stated, and I quote, "There is now a political movement growing which is continuously angry, and stirs up the anger and aggression in society. They are not interested in real solutions, because they need what is wrong, to continue their scolding. That's the only thing they really understand, cursing and hating. They have no positive idea, the only thing they want is to give rein to resentment. They hate intellectuals, they hate artists, they hate culture, they hate anything that is not as ordinary as they are. Perfectly logical in that sense, is that their leader is a populist who will tell everything that the masses want to hear, through which he can mobilize the masses for its own interests. The situation today is the same as in the period of which ter Braak is talking. We have to stop the masses and their populist leaders, for the sake of humanity, the good, justice and fairness, for the sake of beauty. Don't give them the freedom to ventilate their resentment. Thomas Mann already knew that if ever fascism should come to America, it will come in the name of freedom. The mass man can't deal with individual freedom. He is afraid of it and therefore escapes into envy and aggression against anything that is different from him, against the higher culture and spiritual life he can't understand, against the writers, artists, intellectuals, and philosophers who indeed have the capacity to understand and create such beauty. We cannot let the mass man overthrow the elites, because then everything good will be destroyed. Democracy is a danger, because the mass men are in the majority. Their vote has just as much weight as that of an intellectual, artist, writer. De Tocqueville already warned for a dictatorship of the majority of voters. But a majority of voters lacking any proper reasonable capacities, only looking for immediate self-satisfaction of their own lust and greed, missing by nature the ability to love their fellow men, is even worse. And we have to face it, the mass man will always outnumber us. Thomas Mann made perfectly clear that at some point they have to be stopped, even if this means removing their democratic right to vote. We cannot tolerate that they will take over. As Thomas Mann advised, tolerance becomes a crime when applied to evil. And the mass man is evil, evil to the bone, standing between beast and Übermensch. So I conclude. The proof of the correctness of the aforementioned standpoint is to be found in the lessons taught to us by the greatest thinkers of humanity. From their wisdom follows that we have only two choices. Either we continue current democracy, in which case it will be certain that the mass man, thus fascism, takes over, destroying the noble life and a future advancement to the phase of the Übermensch, the overman. or we acknowledge that equality and freedom are no principles to be applied to all people. Up until today we were able to stop the mass man due to our representative democratic system, in which the mass man only has a limited choice between election programs made by the elite. By this, we have prevented them from making a wrong choice. But populist movements are growing despite of it everywhere. The demand for referenda can be heard throughout the Western world, since they have become aware of their lack of influence, their lack of any real power. Referenda will be the death blow for mankind. How should we keep them in check then? How can we control them any longer if their vote, which will be the majority, is decisive, even though it is morally and spiritually wrong, evil? It is time for a new era in human advancement, that is to say, for Nietzsche's leap to the end stage of humanity, so as to separate chaff from wheat, the mass man from Übermensch. Although such a change in mindset is hard, there is no other option. Humanity has entered a new phase, whether you like it or not. We cannot compromise. Thank you very much.
Just so as to be perfectly clear. The aforementioned statements made by Rob Riemen in his speech are statements he really made, and therefore not a joke. He has proclaimed them in many books, interviews, and TV programs. This is indeed how Rob Riemen thinks of fascism and its causes. And this is how he looks at the majority of people, the so-called mass men. And the sources he uses to come to his conclusions are the works of a few humanist philosophers and thinkers. So it is not an exaggerated or satirical gig of me, as you probably may have thought. What is said here in this video, is what Rob Riemen truly means and what he has pronounced and still is pronouncing wherever he has the opportunity to do so. There is only one part of his speech that may not be correct. That is at the end, where Riemen states that common people should not be allowed to vote during democratic elections. To my knowledge he has never said that publicly. But it is not far-fetched to draw the conclusion that he thinks like that if we look at his statements about the common people. They, after all, that is according to Riemen, can't think, are not able to feel love for their fellow man, do not appreciate fine culture, have no spiritual life, no moral values, and are merely selfish, self-centered, xenophobic, racist and dumb. A person like Riemen, feeling so much contempt for ordinary citizens who principally strive for fascism in its worst form, surely will not accept that he has to follow the will of that majority of voters, for then he would be subdued to the wishes of the mass men, the ones he obviously hates so strongly. Therefore, officially Riemen may not have said that he wants to take away the democratic rights of the common people. But, as Riemen said in regard to populist parties that silently have a hidden fascist agenda, that is only officially. Don't be fooled by his nice suit and his references to great human thinkers. Look at what he really is saying. Then you know that he despises the common people so much that he certainly will not agree that they have an equal right of say as he. That is, according to Riemenologics. Now you probably understand why I, at the beginning of this video, made such a fuss about Riemen's deplorable school results, performing much worse than anyone I know. If you lift yourself up to the level of the greatest intellectuals on earth, at the same time humiliating and discarding all so-called ordinary people, it is a bit silly when you have performed yourself intellectually much worse than many of those mass men. That's like a football player from the 4th English Division who is saying he despises all professional football players in the world except Pelé, Maradona, and Messi, and of course himself. In other words, it's illogical according to his own premises. Rob Riemen surely claims and announces that he has objectively established that populist parties are fascist. And he is convinced also that his elaborations about the evil uncontrollable mass man are true. But is there any objective or valid source on which he can build these conclusions? As for his claim that Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom are fascist, as described in his booklet The Eternal Return of Fascism, it is clear immediately that he does not apply correct standards to come to that conclusion. Riemen only uses randomly all sorts of quotations to get to the result he wants to achieve from the start. His way of reasoning is so terribly poor that even a small child will notice that it's a fraud. To put it simple, Riemen acknowledged in this booklet that he cannot define fascism, because this political concept is too diverse to put it in a sound definition. Yet, at the end he concludes anyhow that Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom are fascist. So, I don't know what X is. But Geert Wilders is X. From a rational point of view, that is of course a meaningless and invalid conclusion. Nevertheless, it did not hinder Riemen to shout nationwide and even internationally that he has researched Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom extensively, and that he has objectively assessed that they are fascist. He has proven scientifically that they are. And the whole world had to know it. Riemen shoved his booklet The Eternal Return of Fascism in the P.O. box of all Dutch members of parliament. In newspapers, on the radio and on TV he broadcasted, always mentioning some great philosophers too, so as to give his findings some stature, that it was objectively established by him that Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom were really fascist and that they were a threat for Europe, civilization and human advancement. And the mass media, he says he dislikes so much for their empty shallowness, didn't find it necessary to check any of Riemen's claims or how he came to his conclusion. Like politicians and opinion makers, of which Riemen thinks that they misinform the public deliberately by giving short incorrect messages, he fooled the public by spreading misinformation, only seeking for the wanted result of creating a sought image in the mindset of the public. It was nothing more than sheer ideological propaganda lacking any foundation, yet intentionally disguised as a so-called scientific work. Sad. Riemen's description of fascism in truth refers to an entire other concept than what any person, either scholar or common citizen, relates to fascism. This other concept, which has nothing to do with German or Italian fascism, is founded on casually picked quotations of just a few philosophers and the existence of the so-called mass man. But are there any sound sources that point out that this mass man really exists? Are there sociological or anthropological studies from which follows that there is a subhuman lacking proper intellectual capacities and empathy? Are there neurological or biochemical surveys confirming Riemen's statements? Are there even historical or empirical investigations that at least slightly offer the opportunity to draw such conclusion? No, there aren't. From what we know on the basis of science, the mass man doesn't exist. To put it sharp, there are no humans as described by Riemen. There are no humans who can't think properly, who can't feel love, who lack empathy, who only act out of resentment and envy, who only act out of self-interest and selfishness. Surely some mental disordered persons miss a proper intellect or empathy. But they are the exceptions, usually therefore hospitalized in a mental institution or put in jail due to the crimes they have committed. But the general distinction Riemen makes between an intellectual and cultural elite on the one side, and the barbaric masses on the other, is completely incorrect. I repeat it again. It is not validated by scientific data. It is a self-invented fantasy story. It is clear that not all people are equally intelligent. And it is clear also that intelligence is at least 50% inborn. But is there a connection between a person's intelligence and his ideas and feelings of selfishness, greed, envy, empathy, solidarity, compassion, loyalty, work discipline, or love? No, there isn't. Then is there maybe a connection between appreciating higher culture and arts on the one hand, and the presence or absence of the aforementioned ideas and feelings on the other? In other words, is a person who loves classical music and the paintings of Vincent van Gogh and who reads philosophical books, more inclined to show solidarity, empathy, love for his fellow men, to do good, and so on? No, that has never been established either. The entire concept of the mass man is a non-existing fairy tale. Still it is used by Riemen as an absolute truth to corroborate his ideas. That's as if someone uses quotations from the Bible or Quran to explain the world and humanity, even if these are in conflict with scientifically established facts. It is metaphysical believing, not science and not related to the real world. That in itself is not wrong or bad. Believing and normative reasoning indeed can be valuable, offering new insights or new angles to approach a matter. But it's a huge mistake to apply normative reasoning to real fact-finding and real science, where objectively assessed data and deductive and inductive reasoning are used in the search for a logical relation between a fact, cause and result. Nietzsche's philosophical concept of the Übermensch, for instance, cannot be regarded as a concept to explain the biological nature and further evolution of humans, in the sense that some are able to transcend from an immaterial body into an immaterial state. It is a work of philosophical allegory, where Nietzsche theorizes the Übermensch as a goal for humanity to set for itself. Within normative ethics, this may be a good method of reasoning. But it is a bit silly to think that humans in future really can surpass the stage of man on the line between beast, man, and Übermensch to become an entirely different organism. If that would happen, then not on account of the moral concept Nietzsche has tried to offer us, but after evolutionary changes in the genetic program of humans, either naturally or through artificial genetics. Similarly, the moral and philosophical ideas of other great thinkers in essence have to be interpreted normatively. Riemen clearly mixes up different matters and then loses track by leaving out all other circumstances that may have contributed to the rise of fascism in the pre-war period. That is much too simple and in fact very stupid. Human behavior, including mass behavior, is a complex interaction between independent rationality, culturally learned ideas and behavior, and inborn human emotions, responding in a mutual process to the external circumstances that a human encounters in a specific situation. It is very hard to predict how people will react, although some general directions are detectable. But what is certain is that by ignoring these external circumstances, including picking out just some superficial similarities, you will by definition get the wrong result. And when you then also start to use the false method of reasoning, it can only end in a disaster. And that has happened with Rob Riemen. He is the living proof of the fact that knowing something by heart is not the same as using these learned tools in a sound rational interaction so as to find another insight, maybe even a better one. Not aware of what he is doing, he starts to mingle what he knows, and draws his conclusion therefrom, missing the mark completely. Or even worse, he wants a particular result, for he thinks that this is in line with the noble morality of the intellectual elite he admires, and starts to gather dead wood here and there, pastes the sticks together with an unsuitable glue, and then presents his work as a new human being, that however collapses after the first small wind blow. Is this so terrible, you may ask? Let him play in the woods like a little boy and live out his silly fantasy. If Riemen was just an incident, this would be true. But unfortunately he is not. Not only was Riemen able to spread his false ideas nationwide, but he is also supported by other scholars, like Jan Blommaert and Jan-Jaap de Ruyter from the University of Tilburg, and even by the board of directors of that university. This means that these silly ideas are actually taught to students as the truth nowadays. Moreover, Rob Riemen is the director and founder of the Nexus Institute, receiving many subsidies from the Dutch government to broadcast ideological propaganda as scientific truth, again promoting a wrong ideological idea in order to make it a fixed notion in the public's mind. I think you would feel differently if a university and the government are actively supporting Orthodox Christians or radical Muslims in spreading their false ideas about the world and humanity on the basis of a literal interpretation of their holy book. But the greatest threat lays in the fact that meanwhile more and more highly educated intellectuals really start to think that there is a huge difference between themselves and the middle and low-skilled majority of the population. This changed attitude shows itself, and this particularly among left-wing intellectuals and leftish political parties, in the rejection of more democratic influence for the people. They no longer want a referendum. Instead, they try to transfer as much competences as possible from democratic national institutions to undemocratic international institutions, like the European Union, the Central European Bank and the European Court, all acting on the basis of international treaties that cannot be altered democratically anymore by one nation and not without involvement of the political elites. The speed and extent with which this has happened and is still taking place, is very worrying. Protests of the common people are not valued to their merits, but simply discarded as fascist, racist and stupid, as Rob Riemen does by virtue of the invented fairy tale figure of the mass man who wants to destroy humanity. That's a mindset among many highly educated Dutch, who of course occupy all decisive positions in Dutch society, both in business and in the public sector, and profit from current politics and moral views, a mindset that is very dangerous indeed. And it is not just a theoretical mindset, a normative elaboration of what is supposed to be good and bad. It is applied ever more in the real world today, creating its own believers and at the same time its own victims. Although I do not want to make the same silly mistake as Riemen by calling him a Nazi, I do think it is wise to point him at how sick his ideas really are. For me, the main characteristic of Nazi fascism was the racist doctrine on the basis of which a distinction was made between the Aryan Übermensch and less worthy other races and peoples, with at the bottom of course the greedy and lying Jews. This whole idea was not only morally wrong, but also scientifically false. There are no differences in human races or nations that justify such a difference in treatment. The racist doctrine of inborn Übermenschen and inborn Untermenschen was a fallacy, still causing an incredible human tragedy. Rob Riemen leans with his ideas very close against that false Nazi doctrine. Although he undoubtedly will say that he never said that mass men are people with a medium or low education level, there is no doubt that he is talking about these people. Let's say that someone finds people inferior who live in ghettos of great American cities, are overly represented in criminality and drug abuse, call their children Chinese or Dachshund, wear bling-bling jewelry and hip-hop clothes and like rap music. This someone has not formally mentioned Afro-Americans, but his other indications make clear of whom he is talking. The same goes for Riemen. His description of the mass man makes clear that he regards medium and low-educated people as the lowest of the low, contrary of course to the intellectual and cultural elite. Both are in fact each other's opposite. The noble and the barbaric ones. Race is inborn. But intelligence is for the most part too. It is not so hard to replace Hitler's Übermensch and Untermensch, both based on a false racist doctrine, by Riemen's cultural intellectuals and mass men based on a false doctrine connecting people's value to their intelligence. Knowing that in the Netherlands children from all social and cultural backgrounds are able to follow their maximum education level, the distinction between Riemen's Übermensch and Untermensch is just as well mainly based on inborn features, namely people's intelligence. There is no doubt that people have different intelligent levels, just as there is no doubt that there are different human races and nations. There is no doubt either that people have different taste for music, magazines, and entertainment. But the distinction in moral valuation and factual treatment on account of these differences, made by the Nazis and by Riemen, is in both cases based on a fallacy not confirmed by scientific conclusions. Just as one can't say that people of another race than Aryan are inferior as human beings, one can't say that people with an intelligence level around average or less, are less worthy as a human being and a danger for society and mankind. Not because it is not politically correct to say such a thing, but simply because it isn't true. Man is much more than his rational capacities. Most of a person's characteristics are determined by emotions, like humor, empathy, solidarity, love, hate, sorrow, discipline, loyalty, and so on. There is no link between these emotions and a person's intelligence. I certainly do not have to remind Riemen that the top Nazis who invented their wicked ideology and who directed the implementation thereof in practice, were intellectuals of whom most appreciated culture and the fine arts too. In the former Soviet Union it was not different. One may say that more intelligent people are smarter and more inclined to appreciate high culture and fine arts, but one cannot say that they therefore are more valuable as a human being, and that less intelligent people are just evil mass men as described by Riemen, forming a danger for mankind who have to be stopped by all means. If you really have that opinion, then I find this very, very dangerous and gruesome. Again, I do not think that Riemen is comparable with a Nazi. But he desperately tries to convince me of the opposite with every move he makes. How stupid Riemen's ideas are, becomes immediately apparent when the word mass man is replaced by Jews. Then you will hear the following. Jews are selfish, greedy, xenophobic, racist, lack spiritual value, and are only interested in the maximum satisfaction of their material wants and sexual lusts, irrespective of the costs thereof for others. They are aggressive and act out of envy against anything that is beautiful and worthwhile, against the people among whom they live. They are tempted to march behind a charismatic Jewish leader who says he is representing their interests and that the other people try to destroy the Jews. They are a bacillus that can spread its lethal diseases at any moment. I am sure that Riemen doesn't mean it like that. But then, please, do not say it like that. It is hard to figure out why intellectuals, despite of that they have a certain intelligence and are blessed with some learned knowledge, still keep making the same mistakes over and over again, ignoring reality wherever it stands in the way of their own thought-out ideas. Probably the urge to do good, to create a better world, is to blame for it. That greater cause then quickly justifies all sorts of silly rational connections and intolerable measures. It always leads to blaming others, usually common people, for not having the capacities necessary to make the ideology work in practice. Not that theory itself is wrong, of course, according to its creators. No, the people are wrong. They do not behave as a good person would behave. If they would, then the theory would have functioned in practice very well. Therefore, the people not complying with the ideological role model are bad, are evil, and have to be suppressed or otherwise eliminated. Then everything will work out well after all. All religiously and politically inspired ideologists have fallen in this trap. Overly convinced of the correctness of their own belief, they tried to reshape the world to their own fantasy image. And always with terrible consequences. People are what they are, real people, with good and bad characteristics, both necessary to survive as the organism that they have become today. Ignoring unwanted characteristics because they do not fit within the invented ideal world, may make your theory sound again on the drawing table, but not in real life. It is wiser to acknowledge human characteristics and to adjust your theory to them. Changing the external circumstances, for instance, may encourage people of their own motion to behave in a sought manner. That's better and more effective than ordering them what to do and enforcing them to behave along that line through laws and suppression. The latter only deprives people from their sovereignty and freedom, but it won't change them for good. As soon as suppression stops, all will automatically jump back in the position triggered by the external circumstances in which they live. We have seen this in the past over and over again. Yet, still some dreamers have missed it. Their greater cause makes them blind for reality and lets them reside in fantasy land. But for most people their dreams turn into a nightmare. It is clear that Rob Riemen and many other contemporary intellectuals, still intoxicated by the tabula rasa doctrine, have not read the works of one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Adam Smith, best known for two classic works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, written in 1759, and An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. The latter, usually abbreviated as The Wealth of Nations, is considered his magnum opus and the first modern work of economics. In this work, Smith points at the natural urge of humans to seek for maximum self-satisfaction, which invisible hand automatically will result in a more effective and more balanced economic system than a thought-out planned economy. But some particular parts of his earlier written theory of moral sentiments are noticeable too in regard to sociological, ethical, and political issues, in which according to Smith notice has to be taken too of an invisible hand, consisting of natural urges, emotions, and desires that are of importance for human social behavior, thus in relation to his fellow man. Adam Smith recognizes here that humans participate as individuals in a social community from which they are a member. Inborn emotions, which he calls interests and prejudices, determine a human's thoughts and behavior also. Ideological intellectual dreamers, who do not want to look at these emotions because they have no knowledge of them, are referred to by Adam Smith as men of system. The man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government, that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interests, or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that, in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. Adam Smith made these remarks before Charles Darwin even proposed his evolution theory. He saw that man is not just a rationally acting individual, but an individual who is always at the same time a member of one or more social communities too, in which that individual's ideas and actions are determined also by inborn urges. Ignoring these natural urges, leads to the highest degree of disorder. Recognizing them and taking notice of their possible implications, will lead to a more harmonious and more effective society, not only in economics, but also in social and political life. That's a lesson many today still have not learned, despite of the huge advancements in neurological and biochemical research all confirming Smith's principles. Particularly academics should stick to objective facts and rational argumentation. After having assessed the objective facts and predictable responses as best as possible, we may start moralizing, even using a normative method of reasoning to find the correct morality, but do not work the other way around. Do not start to moralize on the basis of normative reasoning, and then demand that the world adjusts itself to your unproven ideas. That's a recipe for failure, and with that, for a catastrophe.